Progressivism and Society. Lecture terms. An urban age and a consumer society. Focus question. Why was the city such a central element in progressive America? An urban age and a consumer society. In the progressive era, the economy grew enormously as industrial production increased, the population boomed, and the consumer marketplace expanded. For the last time, farms and cities grew together, and agriculture entered its golden age, with growing cities demanding more agricultural goods. But the city was the focus of progressive politics, and the new mass consumer society and the number of cities in the United States, with a population of more than 100,000, grew. The inequalities of urban life, apparent in the 1890s, persisted. Immigrants were living in slums, and the very wealthy were living in isolated neighborhoods and luxurious mansions in most urban centers. J.P. Morgan's financial firm directly or indirectly controlled 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the nation, while more than a third of mining and factory workers lived in poverty. The cities attracted writers and artists who captured its dynamism and modernity. Others saw cities as places where corporate greed eroded traditional American values. A new generation of journalists writing for mass circulation, national magazines exposed the problems of industrial and urban existence. Lincoln Steffen's series for McClure's magazine, published as The Shame of the Cities, showed how party bosses and businessmen profited from political corruption in the cities. In the same magazine, Ida Tarbell pointed to the arrogance and economic machinations of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Theodore Roosevelt criticized this kind of journalism, calling it, quote, muckraking. Novelists produced similarly critical works of fiction, such as The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, whose descriptions of unsanitary slaughterhouses and rotten meat led directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Acts. Immigration. Most characteristic of early 20th century cities was the presence of immigrants. The new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that we talked about in a previous lecture reached its peak in the progressive era. Between 1901 and 1914, about 13 million immigrants came to the United States. Most of them were from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This wave of immigration was part of a global process of immigration, caused by industrial growth and agricultural decline, ultimately. Between 1840 and 1914, when World War I halted migration from Europe, nearly 40 million people immigrated to the United States, and another 20 million moved to other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Elsewhere in the world, millions more people migrated at the same time, mostly in Asia, where they moved to Southeast Asia and to the South Pacific from India and China, and from Russia and Northern Asia to Eastern and Central Asia. While many of these immigrants, pushed and pulled by a variety of factors, moved to America freely, not all immigrated as, quote, free labor. Large numbers of Chinese, Mexican, and Italian migrants were bound to long-term labor contracts, signed with labor agents who provided the contract workers to American employers, much like the indentured servants who came over with the founding of the colonies by the British. Most European immigrants to America entered through Ellis Island in New York Harbor, which became the main facility for processing immigrants. Those who failed a medical examination or were judged to be anarchists, prostitutes, or otherwise undesirable were sent home immediately. At the same time, Asian and Mexican migrants came to the American West, mostly through San Francisco. Although Japanese migration was considerable, Mexican migration was much larger. Between 1900 and 1930, nearly 1 million Mexicans came to the United States, mostly through Texas, and many became cheap agricultural labor. By 1910, 1 of every 7 people in America was foreign-born, the highest percentage in American history. More than 40% of New York's population was born abroad, as was more than 30% in other major cities like Chicago and Milwaukee. Many migrants moved west, most of them settling in industrial centers. Immigrants' quest for freedom. The new immigrants imagined America as a land of freedom, where everyone enjoyed equality before the law, worshipped as they pleased, found economic opportunity, and was emancipated from their homeland's oppressive social hierarchies. While some, such as Jews fleeing religious persecution in Russia, intended to settle permanently, most planned to earn money to return home and buy land. Groups such as the Irish and Mexicans had many such birds of passage who stayed only briefly in the United States. The new wave of immigrants settled mostly in close-knit ethnic neighborhoods with their own businesses and community organizations. They continued to speak their own language and published foreign language newspapers and other publications as well. Churches were central in these communities. Although most immigrants earned more in the United States than they could have at home, they faced long hours, low wages in terms of the cost of living, and dangerous working conditions in the mines, factories, and fields. Consumer society and working women. Cities were also the birthplace of a mass consumption society that gave new meaning to American freedom. The promise of American life had always in part resided in the enjoyment of goods that in other nations were available only to the wealthy. Only in the Progressive era, however, did large downtown department stores, chain stores in cities, and retail mail-order houses for rural residents make accessible the goods produced in America's factories. Though low wages, unequal income distribution, and Southern poverty limited the extent of the consumer economy before World War I, in the Progressive era, mass consumption became a cornerstone of American freedom, understood as the abundance of goods offered by modern capitalism. Leisure activities also were part of mass consumption, with mass entertainment in amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracting large crowds. In this period, motion pictures also became a mass phenomenon, in which even working-class moviegoers attended the Nickelodeons. Traditional gender roles also changed dramatically as women were newly visible in public places such as workplaces, stores, and sites of entertainment. More and more women worked for wages, and although black and immigrant women were still confined to low-paid, low-skilled jobs, native-born white women found expanding opportunities in white-collar work. Women workers were no longer only young, unmarried white women and adult black women. And working women became symbols of female emancipation, showing economic independence from men and moving beyond their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Their desire to participate in the new mass consumer society caused many women, both native and immigrant, to earn money independently of their families, sometimes causing great friction, especially in immigrant families. Fordism. Fewer individuals were more wrapped up in the new consumer society than Henry Ford. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he created production and marketing techniques that brought it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he founded the Ford Motor Company, only one of many small automobile manufacturers at the time. In 1908, 3 short years later, he introduced the Model T, a simple and light vehicle sturdy enough to navigate the country's poor roads. Ford focused on standardizing output and lowering prices in order to bring a luxury good to the masses of consumers. In 1913, Ford's Highland Park, Michigan factory adopted the moving assembly line, in which car frames were brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. This process allowed Ford to vastly reduce the time it took to produce an auto, and thus greatly expand his output. This assembly line would eventually be applied to many other industries all over the world. In 1914, Ford raised his wages to an unheard of $5 per day. This allowed him to attract skilled workers. But assembly line work was monotonous, and Ford used spies and armed detectives to prevent his employees from unionizing. Ford justified the high wages by arguing that workers needed to be able to afford the goods being produced by America's factories. By 1916, Ford's Model Ts were affordable for many workers. The economic system based on mass production and mass consumption came to be called Fordism. The promise of abundance. As production shifted from capital goods like steel and railroad equipment to consumer products, a new advertising industry perfected ways to increase sales, often by linking goods with the idea of freedom, which was a common American cause. Many products used the word liberty as a brand name or used images of liberty as a sales device. Edward Filene, a department store magnate, called consumerism a, quote, school of freedom, as consumers made individual choices on basic questions of living. Abundance came to define the, quote, American way of life, end quote, in which personal fulfillment was attained through acquiring material goods. But if abundance's promise shifted the search for freedom to the private life, it inspired political activism, as those excluded from mass consumption demanded to be included. The desire for consumer goods led many workers to join unions and demand higher wages. And the claim that monopolistic corporations artificially raised prices at the expense of consumers became a weapon against the trusts. The consumer economy gave rise to ideas that offered a new language for criticizing inequalities of wealth and power. In his book, A Living Wage, from 1906, Father John A. Ryan suggested that a decent standard of living was a, quote, natural and absolute right of citizenship, end quote. Ryan attempted to translate into American terms Pope Leo XIII's Declaration of 1894, which was called the Rerum Novarum. This endorsed social justice over competitive and individualistic competition. Demands for a living wage and a decent standard of living were part of the promise of the progressive era, in which some predicted that want and scarcity were disappearing, with capitalism providing abundance and leisure for all. Varieties of Progressivism. Focus question. How did the labor and women's movements expand the meanings of American freedom? Varieties. Progressives wanted to humanize industrial capitalism and find common ground in a society seemingly fragmented by labor conflict and mass immigration. While some desired a return to competitive marketplace of small producers, others accepted the large corporation model and looked to the government to combat a growing concentration of wealth into a small portion of society, as well as looking to government to ensure social justice. Others located freedom in a private sphere of personal fulfillment and self-expression. Nearly all progressives felt that freedom had to take on a new meaning to confront early 20th century social and economic realities. Once again, the notion of freedom was reinventing itself. All kinds of workers complained of a loss of freedom during this period. Large auto, electrical, steel, and other companies sought greater control over work processes and found help in Frederick W. Taylor's method of, quote, scientific management. This was a way of increasing production and profits by scientifically studying and controlling costs and work practices. Many skilled workers saw what became known as Taylorism as an assault on their traditional control over their own work processes, and thus they saw this as a loss of freedom. Greater numbers of white-collar workers, such as salespeople, salaried professionals, and corporate managers, while they were making higher incomes than most workers, they experienced their work as a loss of freedom, as they once would have owned their own businesses, and now they were working for someone else. These developments made, quote, industrial democracy and, quote, industrial freedom central to the progressive language and demands. Many progressives, such as Louis D. Brandeis, an ally of the labor movement and President Wilson's appointee to the Supreme Court in 1916, believed that unions were necessary to give workers a role in economic decision-making, not just over wages and working conditions, but also having a role in managerial decisions such as layoffs and profit distribution. The Socialist Presence. Economic freedom was also the cry of American socialism, which reached its greatest influence during the Progressive era. The Socialist Party, founded in 1901, united late 19th century radicals such as populists and followers of Edward Bellamy with parts of the labor movement. The party called for immediate reforms like free college, laws to improve working conditions, and ultimately proposed democratic control over the economy through public ownership of railroads and factories. By 1912, the Socialist Party had 150,000 dues-paying members. They also published hundreds of newspapers and had significant support in the American Federation of Labor. They also helped to elect dozens of local officials all over the United States. Socialism flourished in immigrant communities, such as among Jews in the Lower East Side in New York City and Germans in Milwaukee, and also gained support among farmers in old populist states like Oklahoma and mining regions in Idaho and Montana. Most important in spreading socialist ideas, and linking socialism to American ideals of equality, self-government, and freedom was a man named Eugene V. Debs. Debs was the former Union leader that was jailed during the Pullman strike of 1894. For 2 decades, Debs toured the nation preaching that, quote, political equality and economic freedom, end quote, could be won only by socialism's democratic control of the economy. Debs united the disparate and often dueling factions of the party. As socialism gained in strength in Europe, particularly in Germany, France, and Scandinavia, Debs led socialism forward in America too. In 1912, he received 900,000 votes when he ran for president. That's nearly 6% of the total number of votes cast. The socialist newspaper, Appeal to Reason, also had the largest weekly circulation in the nation at that time. Socialism was on the rise in America. New unions for labor. Continued labor strife also illustrated the deep discontent of the progressive era. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, their membership tripled to 1.6 million people between the years 1900 and 1904. At the same time that its leaders became closer to corporate leaders willing to deal with unions as a means to stabilizing labor relations. Samuel Gompers, who was president of the AFL, joined with large capitalists in the National Civic Federation, which accepted workers' rights to collective bargaining and, quote, responsible unions. The National Civic Federation helped settle hundreds of industrial disputes and improved safety and created pensions for long-term workers. But most employers still adamantly opposed unions. The AFL mostly represented America's most privileged workers, those that were skilled industrial workers and craft labor workers. Most of these were all white, male, and native-born workers. In 1905, Unionists rejecting the AFL's exclusionist approach formed the Industrial Workers of the World Union. The IWW was both a union and a revolutionary organization dedicated to seizing the means of production and abolishing the state altogether. And it made solidarity its guiding principle. These were direct ideas that came from Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. The IWW sought to organize all workers excluded from the AFL, those like immigrant factory workers, migrant timber and agricultural workers, women, blacks, and even the Chinese. Immigrants and Unions. Mass strikes by immigrant workers placed workers' demands to bargain collectively with employers at the front of progressive reforms. The strikes showed that ethnic divisions might impede labor solidarity, but that ethnic cohesiveness could be a basis of unity if strikes were organized democratically. The IWW was often called to run these strikes, which started spontaneously, and it insisted that each ethnic group have representation on strike committees. Such was the situation in 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, after men, women, and child workers there went on strike against pay cuts. The IWW forged the strikers into a united group. They survived militia and police attacks, and they won the strike on the union's terms. Another famous strike was the 1907 New Orleans dock workers' strike, in which black and white workers made an uncommon cross-racial alliance to resist pay cuts and attacks on their unions. Perhaps the most famous strike was a failure, the strike by the United Mine Workers against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company for union recognition, wage increases, an 8-hour day, and the right to live and shop in places not owned by the company. The owners in this strike responded to the strike by evicting strikers from their houses that they controlled. And after armed militia surrounded a tent colony erected by the strikers, they attacked the tent city in April of 1914, killing up to 30 men, women, and children in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. Union struggles put free speech at the center of progressive reform. Even while courts rejected unions' claims to be exercising First Amendment rights, labor struggles created the modern demands of civil liberties so critical in the 20th century. In many areas, especially, quote, company towns, quote, dominated by an employer, workers were not free to speak out without being fired or worse. The IWW, in particular, waged a series of free speech fights as a means of organizing unions in the West. When IWW members were arrested and jailed for speaking in public, the union would send hundreds and thousands more members to speak, forcing the local governments to arrest all of them. Eventually, local officials would become overwhelmed and would allow the IWW members to speak. The new feminism. Quote, feminism first became a widely used word in the progressive era. In 1914, a mass meeting in New York that debated the question, what is feminism, was organized by Heterodoxy, a women's club in Greenwich Village. The club was part of a new radical, quote, bohemia, which was a social circle of artists, writers, and others who rejected conventional rules and practices. Its definition of feminism merged calls for the vote and greater economic opportunity with open discussions of sexuality. Before World War I, in Greenwich Village and equivalent neighborhoods in Chicago, San Francisco, and other cities, a, quote, lyrical left, end quote, took shape that included discussion clubs, experimental theaters, and magazines. All of these anticipated the emancipation of the human spirit from 19th century prejudices. Isadora Duncan, pictured here, created a new expressive dance, and this became one symbol of the era, a new modern dance. Freedom was central to the lyrical left's vision of society, but their individualist notion of freedom was quite different from other progressives' interest in order and efficiency. Yet sexual freedom came alive in this period. Free sexual expression and reproductive choice became critical elements of women's liberation for many women. New sexual attitudes spread beyond Bohemia to many young, unmarried, and independent women. And the new tolerance for sexual freedom drew gay people to Greenwich Village for the first time. The birth control movement. Women's growing presence in the labor market strengthened demands for birth control, giving political expression to changes in sexual behavior. In the 19th century, the right to, quote, control one's body meant the ability to refuse sexual advances, including those of a husband. But now it meant enjoying an active sexual life without necessarily bearing children from those encounters. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, regularly wrote and lectured about the right to birth control and various contraceptive devices. She was arrested very often as well. Margaret Sanger placed birth control at the center of the new feminism. By 1914, after facing censorship from the U.S. Post Office for writing about how to use birth control, she openly advertised birth control devices in her own journal, called The Woman Rebel. She argued no woman could be free who did not control her own body and decisions about whether to become a mother. In 1916, when Sanger opened a clinic in a working-class area of Brooklyn and started giving contraceptive devices to poor Jewish and Italian women, she was jailed for a month. Labor radicals and cultural modernists, not just feminists, promoted Sanger and birth control. Native American progressivism. Even Native Americans share the progressive impulse. The Society of American Indians, founded in 1911, was a typical reform organization. It united Indian intellectuals around discussion of Native Americans' problems and sought to arouse public awareness of these issues. It brought together Indians from many different backgrounds and created a pan-Indian public space free from white influence. Many in the society shared the basic goals of federal Indian policy, including transforming communal lands on the reservations into family farms. But the group's founder, Carlos Montezuma, became an avowed critic of this idea, and he condemned government paternalism and demanded the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He called for self-determination and for Indians to be granted full citizenship